The book, Women Engaged Art in Post-War Bosnia, is about the influence that women in Bosnia-Herzegovina, actually the entire country, have had in public spheres since the war, and their contributions to reconciliation and, perhaps more important from the global perspective, the growth of civil society for this fledgling democracy. It's very interesting. There have been a lot of changing of there's been a lot of changing of roles for women at this time, and it developed out of an interest since the end of the war. Well, during the war, but as far as research goes, since the end of the war in 1995. The Bosnian War was 1992 to 1995. In simply the area. I work in Russia and worked in Yugoslavia, now former Yugoslavia. My research before the war was not specifically on Bosnia. In fact, I studied in Zagreb, the capital of Croatia. But I was dismayed and obviously very concerned about the fate of this republic and then new country and the results of the war. So I started working in cultural studies. I had turned toward cultural studies in my work on Russia. It was fairly natural, especially the issues of women in war. And I began studying the issue of multiculturalism because everyone, particularly of my generation, the middle generation during the war, people who, my friends and colleagues who were raised in this notion, Tito's notion, of brotherhood and unity, believed in Yugoslavism, and they believed that they had a multicultural country. And so when the war broke out, and after the war when people looked at this horror, they asked themselves, why did this happen? So I set out to study what Yugoslavia actually was, not what I thought it was, but what it was. And particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was the most multi-ethnic republic, the crossroads of, and I don't want to start specifically in terms of religion, but it's a fact, the crossroads of Serbian Orthodoxy, of Judaism, of Roman Catholicism, and of Islam, in particularly this republic. And it was the most diverse republic. It was the capital, Sarajevo, was the city that had the most intermarriage among ethnic groups. About 30%, what were called mixed marriages, occurred in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. And that was the view that Bosnia was a multicultural republic and the most multicultural part of Yugoslavia, and the emblem for what their ruler, Tito, wanted for Yugoslavia, brotherhood and unity. That was an idea and a self-identification, and I set out to look into that. So my first work started with a study of multiculturalism, and I found, and there are mixed feelings about this, but I do believe that Bosnia indeed was not as multicultural as it thought it was, even though people did know about other people's customs and their religions. They didn't intermarry much, and the kind of intimacy you need for true multiculturalism is really what the Bosnians refer to as the marriage bed. That only those mixed marriages really had the true knowledge of the other ethnicity. And respect there may have been, but true knowledge and understanding not necessarily. So, but as I was studying the aftermath of the war and the degree to which multiculturalism was talked about, the three M's they would call them, they were multi-multi and multi-ethnic and multi-confessional. And I forgot what this third multi, but they began not to look back and say, were we, but to look forward and say, this is what we must be. And what I realized was that as far as reconciliation, working across ethnic lines, that it was really women who were primarily engaged in this, and primarily through non-governmental organizations. The non-governmental organizations, and there were hundreds after the war, were a development from women's organizations and peace organizations during the war, led, and even before, as far as women's organizations before the war, led by women. And after the war, the international community, as they say, poured money into Bosnia-Herzegovina. They didn't want to give it to a nationalist government which survived the war, or actually two nationalist governments. I will talk in a minute about that. But they gave a lot of money to these organizations led by women. And this is what was very different. Yugoslavia was a communist country, non-aligned, was not in the Warsaw Pact, but like all of Eastern Europe, with communism came increased opportunities for women in the public sphere. As far as education goes, sometimes there were quotas. I mean, there were quotas as far as organs of the government go. So in that respect, women in Eastern Europe were really ahead of women in Western Europe and North America as far as the right to vote, the representation in government, and the ability to work men's jobs, if you will. However, during that time, women did not run things. They did not rise to the highest levels of government. They did not run their factories. The difference after the war is that women really began to run things in the non-governmental organizations. They also started to run things in the media. They became the main editors of newspapers and news magazines. Women were always active in the arts, and this becomes the segue into this part of this long project. But their art changed, and they were engaged in reconciliation, fostering reconciliation, and the growth of civil society. And by that I mean they took on some very hard questions that the nationalist government was not interested in having anyone ask about all sorts of questions, you know, where money was going, who was at fault in many cases during the war, and they would not take a strict nationalist line in the Federation. I now say I have to do a bit of an aside just to explain what has, since the war, what remains in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The result of the Dayton Peace Accords in 1995 were a bipartite country. The Serb Republic, which is predominantly ethnically Serb and Serbian Orthodox. Now people do think of religion. They didn't in a communist, atheist state. And the Federation, which is an entity primarily of Bosnian Croats, who, if they practice religion, are Catholic, and Bosniaks. Bosniak is the term that Bosnians now, Bosnian Muslims call themselves, in English, Bosniaks. And the Bosnian Croats and the Bosniaks now have another part of the government. So there are two parts to the government. This is what the Dayton Peace Accords left this country. And the borders of these two entities are along the lines of the territories that were ethnically cleansed during the war. So it is a very, Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's not, I wouldn't call it a failed state, but it's an ungovernable state. And this has affected economy, the growth of, reconciliation, because of, for that matter, because of this situation that really fosters nationalism and ethnic isolation. So it's very important, how this country goes forward, particularly when the international community has moved on to more what they consider to be more serious crisis areas, is a very thorny problem. Bosnia-Herzegovina will never get into the EU. In the state that it now is in, it is ruled essentially by the High Representative, a representative from the European Union, who was appointed. That came out of the Dayton Peace Accords, but it was never meant to be set in stone. So it's sort of lost in time, this place that can't govern itself. And what is being done? There is still rising nationalism on all sides, and it is associated with the ethnic groups, the three ethnic groups. And they have chosen now to identify themselves by religion, which they didn't before the war. And along with that comes what usually happens with nationalism, and that is a rise in patriarchy, traditionalism, bad news for women. So it is women who are very, very interested. They're interested in reconciliation, a country that works, and they feel that a way forward, and I don't speak for all women, but the women that I deal with, They feel that a way forward is to develop a civil society where you can question the government. And by that I simply mean this gray area between the citizenry and the government, a free media, grassroots organizations that can, for instance, that question what is going on in the government. The role of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, in the fostering of civil society has been recognized by other researchers. But the media, for instance, has not been studied. That would be future work, the role of women in the media. The role of women in the arts has also not, until this work, to my knowledge, has not been considered from this perspective specifically. And what I found very interesting, because I have a long history in Slavic studies, is the 180-degree turn that artists have made, and by artists I mean in the broad term writers, those women working in the plastic arts, and I speak again of women, not that men have not done this, but it is predominantly women. The degree to which they have engaged art in the communist period, to be politically engaged was to be less of an artist because you weren't free. If you have a totalitarian government and the arts are meant to further the ideology, it runs counter to what most artists consider a free art. Now these same women, many of them were established artists, writers before the war, have now decided that this is what they absolutely need to do. And it's happening across the board, in writing, in artwork, exhibitions, and another area related to this is women arts administrators, the women curators, women preparators, women who are have very important positions, for instance, in the Penn Center, the writers' organization. And they are mounting exhibitions, organizing seminars, and at these events, or even in the works of arts that are works of art that are presented in exhibitions, for instance, these issues are being challenged, and how Bosnia-Herzegovina is going to move forward, and how there must be freedom to question the traditionalism or limitations on free speech, for instance, that have gone hand in hand with nationalism, religious conservatism. So I have moved from simply studying what Yugoslavia was to what women were doing to make it something else. And because my area originally was language, literature, culture, when I saw that, recognized how important women in the arts were to this general, to these spheres of influence that women have today, running things and having particular goals, it was natural for me to focus in a monograph, a longer piece, on women, specifically women in the arts. A good example of a writer who questions the status quo now, post-war in Bosnia, and if we consider her life as a writer, the difficult position for women who are in the public sphere today is Jasna Šamić, a Bosniak writer. She is also an academic, and what is called there an Orientalist. She is a professor of Islam, in fact, and she is also a writer. She has written some interesting works. She spent the war in emigration, well, I should say in emigration, but she was out of the country in France at that time, which is a problem in and of itself. After the war, there was a lot of questioning about artists, writers, prominent people who did not remain in Sarajevo during the entire siege of Sarajevo, 1992 to 1995, who emigrated quickly after the war. They were seen immediately after the war as traitors, that you really had to stay there, you had to suffer along with everybody else. So Jasna Šamić, as a writer, had to deal with this situation that a lot of writers had to deal with. A very well-known writer worldwide today is Aleksandar Hemon, who spent the war in Chicago And he is a fantastic writer. He is acclaimed around the world, actually. He writes in English. He also did not spend the war in Sarajevo, but now he writes a column for the independent weekly Dani, as another writer who emigrated after the war does. So it's not just women. All the writers had to deal with their position post-war. In her novels, Jasna Šamić has spoken about this issue of those who did not spend the entire war in Sarajevo, who come back and are no longer considered one of ours, and suffer various kinds of, well, not necessarily persecution, but exclusion from the arts scene or opportunities to work. And that's one, and that's a cultural issue that she has addressed. She has also addressed, and this is something rare, that's why I spent a number of pages on Jasna Šamić. She spends pages talking about Islamization. Bosnia was secular. If a small majority, it was very multi-ethnic, but if culturally to look at Sarajevo, you see the Ottoman past, the nearly 400 years of Ottoman rule in Bosnia. You also see cathedrals and Orthodox, I should say Catholic and Orthodox churches, cathedrals, but the feel of Sarajevo is Muslim, and yet it was a secular society, and people didn't pay attention generally, and especially in urban areas, to what your name looks like. And in Bosnia, often you can tell a name, how a name has been changed slightly to reflect the association of the family with the Ottomans. She in her novel, it's a moment that I describe in the book. The protagonist, who is highly autobiographical, goes to a restaurant in Sarajevo, and the waiter tells her that they do not serve alcohol because this is a national restaurant. And she asks him whether he is familiar with the Bosnian tradition of, and she uses a Bosnian word of Turkish origin to indicate what Bosnians themselves would refer to as a good night out with alcohol and partying. And she said, and I don't think that custom originated on the left bank, because obviously this waiter knew she'd been in France and she's westernized. And so she really wants to make clear the fact that this Islamization, this institution of observant Muslim law in various ways in Sarajevo is something foreign, very foreign. There's a very important work called Being Muslim, the Bosnian Way, by an anthropologist named Tone Bringa. And in this entire work, she talks about the fact that Bosnians have always, even under the Austro-Hungarians, have practiced Islam in a different way. So this Islamization is very much an import that is foreign to Bosnians themselves. It is part of the Bosniaks' search for identity. Many of them turn to Islam because they want faith, and because also any expression of religion was officially squelched under Tito, who ruled from the end of World War II until 1980, when he died. And so there is a generation or two generations of people who want to find their identity, and it may be through Islam. But Šamić's point is that this has to be a free choice. And this is what I hear many times when I speak to women, whether in the media or women writers. It's not that they want to say to Bosnians, we are not observant, we are not Muslim. What they want to say is it is our choice if we want to be observant or not. So she actually deals with this. And why it is so important is that generally people do not talk about this conflict between a fledgling democracy, the increase in leadership roles for women on the one hand, and this rise in nationalism, traditionalism, and Islamization, if I'm speaking about the Bosniak part of Bosnia. It happens with every religion in these enclaves. And why? On the one hand, everyone wants to preserve a fragile peace. That's one issue. They might be concerned about their jobs. I mean, if the government is nationalist, can be consequences. And there's also the fact that Bosnia-Herzegovina does not want to present a face to the rest of the world as being full still of ethnic tensions after the war. There have been studies on the role of NGOs, and they've said that women who run NGOs, people who run NGOs, they do not want to tell their donor nation that they are that there's obstructionism coming from the government, or pressure for Islamization or a change in practice. They do not want to tell the donor nation or the donor organization that there might be this pressure, because they want the support to continue. They do not want the donor nation to see this as a problem that they might want to walk away from. So there are many reasons why there is not open discussion of nationalism, traditionalism related to the identification with religious faith, and what is of a concern always to Western Europe, and that's Islamization, that kind of a rise in interest in religion that is Islamic. And Jasna Šamić does that. As for her personal story, I include an interview with the editor of Dani magazine. That's the independent news weekly in Sarajevo. And actually, he was, he's well known. He's studied at Harvard. He was at Harvard for a year, a very well known and respected journalist. But when in this long interview with Šamić, he asks her why she has had such problems with in the community in Bosnia and beyond. People think that she is a fundamentalist, and she responds to him, "Well, I can thank you for that, because we met, and I forget now where they met, but we met, and you said to me that you really couldn't publish my work or whatever it was, an essay in Dani, which is an independent weekly, because I had written for the Bosniak publication Lilian." And she went on to mention a number of well-known writers, not just Bosniak, Bosnian Muslim, but Bosnian Croat, the best-known Bosnian Croat Bosnian Croat writer has written for them. And they are all men, and none of them have suffered this labeling as fundamentalist, because they chose, among many other places, to publish in what is considered to be a conservative Bosniak publication. And she made that point to him. On the other hand, she's been reviewed by more traditional, literary critics, and they have noted that she lives too freely. Just in their reference to her, there is a certain condescending, derogatory tone. She is an intellectual. She speaks freely and lives a life which you would not call as observant Muslim. And so she's gotten it from both sides. So it's quite a dilemma. She can speak with great authority about Islamization, being actually an academic, a professor of Islam. And she is also a writer. And she is at the same time both a fundamentalist and a free thinker, or free liver, if you will. So I think her case is very interesting because she is a Bosniak writer and also someone whose writing has been accepted in a traditional a literary journal, Bosnian Muslim. So I think her case is, most instructive as far as the problems for women in the arts. I plan in the future to address this segment of this long project, which I haven't done in a written form yet, and that is women in the media. These women who not only are editors of the newspapers or magazines, the weeklies, the news magazines, but also women who have shows on television stations or on the radio. They contribute as well to these spheres of influence, as I call them, women who are working. Reconciliation is there's been movement on that, but the growth of civil society is where it is now very seriously. And I hope that I will have the continued support. I've had very firm support and generous support from the library and from various sources at Boston College for my research, which is now going on 15 years. I really began working in Bosnia more specifically since the end of the war in 1995. And it's been very helpful, and I have, in fact, I hope that my association with the library will go both ways, because Boston College has made it possible very soon after the war for me to get some volumes of literature that were published by the Soros Foundation, for instance, and really weren't available very easily. And I hope that sometime I can turn my library over to O'Neill Library, because the library and the library staff has been very helpful for me to get the materials I need for this research. I've been encouraged. Well, I've encouraged myself in this work because I care so very much about this fascinating place. Yugoslavia was the size of Oregon, and it had such diversity. It was really a remarkable place, and now it's in a number of different countries. But it's really through my heart. I've been driven by my attachment to this place and what it could stand for the world. What an example it might be if it can work, despite what happened there, which was really not about the failure of multiculturalism. It was more about interested parties sowing discord. So I have worked for these years hoping actually that there is some policy significance to what I do. And by that I mean the international community needs to revisit the Dayton Peace Accords. This country will never survive unless they do. And although there are many more people working on the region than there were before the war, there still aren't enough. And there are many crisis areas in the world. But the fact is that we were front and center with the peace accords, the peace treaty that was signed. And I think we need to finish that job, as well as the international community. So my hope always with anything that I publish on Bosnia-Herzegovina or former Yugoslavia in general is with the hope that it will bring some attention back to this place where a job remains to be done, or the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina really do have no future. And that has really been the main impetus to my work.